Welcome to All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast. This podcast will explore all the subjects that make the insecure squirm in their seats. Religion, politics, local and national, the Constitution of the United States, and the wheel of love and hate, to just name a few. Stay with us as we use our freedom of speech to delve into the good and the bad. If this podcast is not for you, feel free to find another one. Without any further ado, here comes All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast. All right, welcome to another episode of All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About. You can find more episodes at tabootalkback.com. This week, Amanda Jones is the panel, and myself, Rob Byrd, who's hosting, and I don't even know if I can call you a special guest anymore now that we're on three of them. You're just our religion contributor, I would say. It's almost like a staff position. Milan Bittenbender.
Can I just be part of the team?
You know what?
Coach?
The best part of the team.
I like that philosophy. And as an athlete, yes, you could be part of our team. And
awesome.
I certainly appreciate everything that you're doing. And your podcast, Halftime with Milan Bittenbender. I hear there's a couple good ones coming your way. So normally I get you at the end, but let's get you at the very beginning and just tell you what you got coming up on your podcast.
Well, just today I interviewed a Dr. Miranda Cruz. She kind of specializes in religion and politics. She says I'm a lot of fun at parties.
Yeah. Well, religion and I guess that kind of would be. It's like the two things that they say don't ever talk about in public. So she does both. But and that is kind of cool. And when you first said that to me earlier before we started, I said religion and politics. How can it be? But when you do look at politics and our laws, almost every law that we have written is based on something that is from religion or biblically.
Well, and so much of it comes down to things that are, morally questionable. There's deep moral implications to a lot of the laws and the things that we're doing. And that's why a lot of times people of religion get deeply involved and sometimes triggered.
Sure. And of course, I mentioned it earlier, just a second ago, but tabootalkback.com you can go to and you hear the previous two episodes that we did with Milan, one about the decline of religion or the decline of America, basically. And then, of course, we started kind of digging into Genesis, and we talked a little bit about that. And we're going to continue that conversation with Genesis 3. And Milan says this is about the fall of man. Yeah. And that's what we'll title this episode, The Fall of Man. So we're a couple chapters into the book now, and Genesis 3, I guess, take it from there.
Yeah, well, this initial podcast conversation started out with the decline in America. And a lot of times, we look at what's going on in the world and we think that there's some big decline, but really the decline started a long time ago. As a matter of fact, us humans didn't make it very far into our history.
Two chapters, basically.
Yeah. But before we exercised our God-given opportunity to choose to simply surrender to him or to take matters into our own hands and try to run our own lives, basically.
Yeah. So now when we're talking about the fall of man, this would be really the story of Adam and Eve, correct?
Yeah.
And temptation. It's really a story of temptation and man having, being weak and falling to temptation and then being cast out of the Garden of Eden. And a lot of people say, was there a physical garden? Was there a garden, or was this a place that was like a utopia in your head? Was it a physical place? Was it where was the Garden of Eden, or what was it?
Yeah, well, the Bible actually tells us where it was. It gives us very specific geographical location in relation to the rivers and stuff like that. Basically, where the Red Sea, the northwestern part of the Red Sea, there's some rivers that come out there. And actually, based on what we see there, it's possible that the Red Sea is actually larger than it was then. And maybe what was the Garden of Eden is actually underwater now. But yeah, it was basically in that area.
Yeah, and pretty much everything biblically is kind of out of that Middle East area, is it not? And how far, when you look at the Bible, how far does it extend out of that area? I mean, does it even get to where we know as Europe these days, or to that we know of as Russia? Where was all this? Where was the central location of the Bible?
Yeah, most of the Old Testament stuff, what we read is going to give us insights into what was happening in what is modern day Palestine. But actually, the Garden of Eden would have been in modern day Iraq, I believe. So some of Iran, some of Iraq, Syria, modern day Israel. Obviously, in the Old Testament, Egypt. The family of Abraham went down to Egypt when Joseph was in charge there, and the people of God literally were in Egypt for about 450 years, and then they moved back into modern day Palestine, the Promised Land.
Sure. Well, and see, sometimes I say that's where everybody says God never makes a mistake, but it almost seems like he would want to be in the United States. It would be a much nicer place than the desert, don't you think?
Well, what's interesting though is, obviously the Earth changes. There's geological changes, and that space was described as a fertile crescent. So back in that time, it was different than what it is now. Much more fertile. And
I'm just kind of being silly with that, but there's a lot of rivers there: the Euphrates, the Thames, and I'm not that good with my geology, and I should have looked at all this or pull up a map before I start talking. But when you have that many rivers and that much water, yes, it's going to be like it is here. I mean, it's just a beautiful place. We're lush and green because we have all the water you could ever want.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So why did God give that temptation? Why not just make his Garden of Eden, and why say just everything you can do, it's all yours? Why put that temptation in front of man?
Well, let me start by saying the Bible doesn't answer the why question. There's no verse you can look up that would say, so God put the tree in the garden for this purpose. But and again, as I've said before, these are all my opinions based on my own study and my own experience. So take them for that, what that's worth.
And I'll say the same thing. When I ask these questions, this is from my early days and from the little fragments that I am able to pull up now, so that's why I at least have some little bit of a knowledge. That's why I can at least be able to help bring you deeper. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the same for Amanda also, not to speak for her, but she had certainly a background growing up in religion and the church and Bible studies and all that. So it's just kind of one of those things where there's so I can't even wrap my mind around the right word for it, how deep it actually goes.
Yeah. There's layer upon layer, which is, we find that in everything about humanity, our relationships, religion, politics, all of those kinds of things, very, very deeply layered things. Human life is very, very complex. And I would say the reasons behind this would be very complex. And I can't say this is why God put the tree in the garden, but in the very beginning of humankind, God placed two trees in the middle of the garden, the tree of life. I believe the tree of life represents man's opportunity to put his trust fully in God and just reach out by God's grace and mercy and God's generous provision to take the fruit of life and eat of it. The Bible implies that Adam and Eve would live forever simply by partaking of this fruit. Now, I don't think the fruit itself had some kind of chemical makeup that made them live forever, but I think it was part of a system, and they were offered to eat freely of the tree of life. But also in the middle of the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think the name there is fascinating to me. What does that mean? And I believe, again, going to my opinion, I believe that God provided another way for man to choose to live. Okay, you can come to me and simply depend upon my grace, and we know that anytime you depend on somebody else, there's a relational dynamic there. But the other option that God wanted to give mankind was the option to take that into your own hands and become basically the master of your own destiny. All right. Now, you know good from evil, and you can, quote unquote, make choices about what is right and wrong and good and bad for you. And I believe that that was done out of absolute love. I mean, those of us who've had children, we know that, well, those of us who've been children, if our parents simply said, this is the only option you've got, that doesn't feel very loving.
Right.
We want our kids to have a certain amount of individuality and be able to make their own choices. And that freedom is very, very important. And God wanted to give that option, but he knew that as long as we put our own choices in front of him, that now you've deviated from the perfect source, and now decisions that are made are going to have consequences.
Amanda?
It's almost like, not to say, oh, it's like going from a child to an adult, but it almost kind of, it feels that way, I guess, as it's written out, when you think of the knowledge of good and evil. And when you're a kid, you're so innocent.
Yeah.
You want to believe everything your father or your mother tell you. And then at a certain point, you start hearing things from other people or seeing things from different people. And that's just kind of how it works out in my brain, at least.
What happens if they're right?
What do you mean?
If the parents are right, because all of us, I think, growing up, whatever our parents tell us, we want to go the opposite way. It's
Right.
almost like politics now. If the right side does this, the left side is going to do the exact opposite, and vice versa. And that's kind of, that's the rebellion thing growing up. Our parents say this, well, eventually we're going to fight against that.
Yeah.
And what happens after is either you come back or you don't.
Mm-hmm. Love requires freedom. If there's not freedom, I don't think you can really make an argument for true love there.
Yeah.
And I believe that God's desire was to give us that freedom to either choose to completely simply depend upon him and live fully under his grace, or to choose our own destiny for ourselves.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the poem, if you love something, set it free. If it comes back to you, it was yours. If it doesn't, it never was.
Right. Well, we're supposed to have that free agency too on this world to make our decisions and our choices and see what we end up with, I guess, at the end of it, and see.
Yeah.
It's one of those things you don't know until it's over. But then when it's over, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to have too many questions. I don't think any of it's going to matter.
Yeah, great insight. I think our eyes will be opened in ways, and our eyes are being opened now. There's certain things that we're learning about life and stuff, but I think one day our eyes will be opened and there will be no more questions.
And I really think what's happening, especially with politics these days, I think it is God's plan. I think that he had to show us something to realize the error in it.
Well, Romans actually says that the law was put in place to show us the moral character of God, not to condemn us or to put us down, but to show us how desperately we needed him, to show us that we, in and of our own broken nature, are absolutely incapable of living up to his moral law. And in that, then highlighting our need for God's provision in Christ. And that's the thing that amazes me is that man chose to rebel against God. That rebellion has produced terrible fruit in our actions and the way that the world has unfolded since. And it would have been absolutely just for God to say, okay, you chose to reject me. I created you. I gave you life. And so I'm just going to, wipe the whole thing out and start over. But he didn't do that. He knew that we couldn't repay the debt that we owed him based on our rebellion. And instead of requiring payment on our part, he sent his son to make payment for us. That's amazing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly way down the road here.
Yeah.
But back to Genesis, you have a choice. You have a choice between the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. What was the reason for why can we have something that's so perfect and so wonderful, and yet we have to toe the line and try the fruit on the other side, on the other tree?
It's deception, brother. Deception. And In that chapter, Satan is introduced. We see this evil entity. We could get into that whole story where he came from too. We might want to get into that at some point. But as we see all the way throughout history, deception is entered in. And really the conversation that the serpent has, Satan in the form of a serpent has with Eve, causes her to doubt God's goodness, the first thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did God really say that? And, well, God just knows that if you eat of this fruit, your eyes will be open, you'll be like him. And he begins to put this doubt in Eve's mind that God really has her best intentions. And so she begins to wonder. And as soon as we begin to doubt that God actually loves us and cares about us, we rebel against that love, and usually bad things happen.
Yeah. And I mean, like I said, it just seems to mirror real life now. It's the same thing if you look at our parents as God, they're not, but as a child, they are.
Yep.
When you look at your parents, they're everything.
Yeah.
So we have the same story still exists today, every day.
Yeah. Well, they're everything in our mind until we reach that point where, the innocence Amanda, you spoke about, right,
Mm-hmm.
begins to wane, and we begin to look at the world. And all of a sudden, these parents that have loved us and taken care of us, obviously not every parent in the world is like that, but most of us came from a home where our parents made incredible sacrifices for us.
Yeah.
And then we begin to get out in the world, and others begin to taint our view of our own parents and make us question their goodness, and we begin to rebel. And begin to make other choices. And then, so for the next 10 years, our parents get stupider and stupider until life has its way with us. And then all of a sudden our parents start getting smarter and smarter. And it's that process. Yes, it repeats over and over and over and over again.
And that's just that, to me, that's our flaw.
Yeah.
That's our fatal flaw. It could be, maybe not yet. Maybe we haven't hit that fatal mark yet, but eventually that could be the fatal flaw that is the end of mankind.
Well, sure. In a physical sense, yes. A big question that people have is about, okay, well, God said, if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die, right? So Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and they didn't keel over dead. What's that about? As a matter of fact, they lived for, according to the Bible, hundreds of years more.
Well, it's just like that innocence.
Was that their curse, though? The 100 years more, a curse?
Oh, if they were living in the world we're living in right now, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
But to them, when you look at that world, because apples and oranges, but you're still, it seems like it's always the same story, just different faces.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. No, but what a lot of people don't understand is that, again, we are a soul. At the core of our nature, we are a soul who has a body, right? We've got a vehicle that we do life in, but at the end of the day, we are a soul. And we have a spirit connection to God and to the rest of creation. And I believe that the death that God spoke about was a spiritual death. So there was a separation, a spiritual death. The soul continued to live. The body continued to live. But at the end of the day, that spiritual death would become the problem, right, that mankind deals with, relationships and everything else. And again, when we read the New Testament, we read that Jesus came to bring new life to that spirit part of who we are.
Now, a lot of times when you think about the Bible and think about the story we're talking about now, we're looking at a specific geological location. Did the Bible ever in those times talk about what was happening outside of that?
Not a lot. There are some references, for example, after Cain killed Abel, where did he go? It kind of tells about different things. Not much. And for the most part, we believe that people probably stayed in that general area until we read later on the Tower of Babel. Can't remember exactly what chapter that's in. That's still in Genesis. And all the people peoples of the world were kind of separated by language barrier at that point, and then began to scatter. The Bible actually tells us they began to scatter at that point.
So really at that, at the point we're at, this is the epicenter of the world. This is where everybody is.
Yeah.
And the creation that he made put it right there. He did not create anything else. I mean, he has all the animals, and I mean, you look at our species that we have and how many have been gone that he created. Where were they? Were they in that epicenter too, or were they cast out? Were they around the world? Do we have any?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's one to think about at home.
I don't have an answer for that one, Rob.
Yeah. All right. Well, I certainly like being able to come up with a question like that, because to me, it's like, all right, if that's the epicenter, where did he put all these animals? Where did he put all these insects? Because if he put 42 trillion mosquitoes all right there in a square mile, that would be miserable.
Well, and I actually have more questions. I'm wondering about the creation of mosquitoes. That might have been even worse than the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
Well, it's the same thing. It's the balance. And mosquitoes are not bad.
No.
They're just doing their thing. They're just a nuisance to us or into other animals, but they are needed.
Yeah.
Bats eat them.
Yeah.
Bats, and we need bats. I mean, so, all right. So, getting back to they tasted the wrong fruit. They went the wrong way with the tree of good and evil. God cast them out. Now, where are they going?
We don't know exactly. I mean, we do see they migrated further on down the line. Man migrated to different places, but basically here in Genesis at the end of chapter 3, God places cherubim at the entrances to the garden, and they are not allowed to re-enter to eat from the tree of the tree of life, and I think that's God's way of saying, okay, you've chosen to live by your own device, then you will live by your own device.
Now, they were the only people in the Garden of Eden. At least that's my vision of it.
Yeah.
Now they're out. They're kicked out. What happens to the Garden of Eden?
We don't really know. The Bible doesn't tell us. Like I said, it's very possible that that's underwater. I don't know if God, just said, well, that was what it was. I provided it for them. They don't need it anymore. And so over time, it just became overgrown and, whatever. I don't know. And you could ask the question too, where is the tree of life? The next time we see the tree of life show up, it's actually in Revelation. The Bible speaks of the tree of life in Revelation that produces its fruit for the 12, seasons. It's available all of the time in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah. And things that you said earlier, that could be underwater. So if the tree of life is coming back, that in Revelations, that means that water had to recede and to reveal the tree of life.
Well,
and we've been having, there have been lots of stories of this happening all over that area where the rivers are going low and they're finding monuments, they're finding tombs, they're finding all kinds of stuff underneath the rivers that they never knew was there. So
yeah,
it's not, I mean, to me, certainly, even if you want to be a skeptic, it's now not past the realm of possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. When I was in Iraq, I was stationed near Nazareth, that's the birthplace of Abraham. And on the base, I was able to walk around the city of which is in the Bible.
Ur of the Chaldeans?
Yes. And they had dug down deep and they, found the city and all of these things. And I got to walk onto the top of the ziggurat, which was their temple of the day. But anyway, in the city of Abraham, there's these little shells that you'll find just all around. I have a bag of them somewhere. But they say, the tour guides, oh, this was from the flood, from the Great Flood. And so I don't know if they just did that because, oh, wow, look at all these.
Yeah, they bring them in
look
and
at all these
spread
Americans.
those around. Buying shells that we just brought in.
It was one of those things, like, it felt,
real.
You get that prompting.
It felt real, didn't
where
it?
you're just like, wow, no, like, it makes sense. The way that these shells are just everywhere and how under the sand these buildings have been for so many years. So it was very interesting. The Mesopotamia landscape.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, and when we're finding these things, that brings us to the end. Are we finding these things now because God is finally revealing what He had covered up?
Great question.
Yeah. Or is it just a matter of that's the Earth's geology and that's what happened, and rivers do expand and fill and lower, and that's just a part of the way the world works. So there certainly is that. That's a tough one, I think.
Yeah.
Because you could certainly explain that by geological forces that are at work on the Earth, or you can turn around and say it was just flat out God, or something in the middle.
That brings up an interesting point, because a lot of times we rely solely on science to answer all of our questions. I think science. I'm not opposed to science. I think science is,
but science is opposed to the Bible.
Not necessarily.
Well, in lots of cases, like when you talk about like the Smithsonian and stuff, they refuse to acknowledge giants, even though over the course of history, we have found giant, and they still know that they're not real.
There's lots of scientists, though, that do believe in the Bible. Like, God can't work outside the compounds of science anyway.
I think the trouble we have is separating scientists from science. Because you can come to different conclusions, look at the same data and come to different conclusions. And we happen to have usually bias, right? We go into an experiment with a certain perspective.
Sure.
And that
we go into experiments hoping to get results. Yeah, expecting some results. And that's when the best science happens, is when they learn something they weren't expecting.
And so here's the problem I see with science right now. Most science, secular science, is that it assumes that there can be nothing supernatural. And when you go in with that assumption, then you begin to automatically cut out evidences that would lead in that direction.
Sure.
So a big question people would have is, okay, well, how about Adam? We look at the age of the earth according to the biblical record, because the Bible actually is pretty specific about who lived how long and who begat who. And if you can actually do the math, and a lot of people say, oh, that's just not possible. It's not possible. It's not possible. Well, I think of it like this. What if God created the earth in such a way that it was somewhat, that when it was created, it was quote unquote matured, right? So a lot of the things that we say an evolutionary process would have to produce, well, what if it was like that? Well, then the pushback is, well, that's ridiculous. Why would God do that? Well, let me ask the other question then that leads to that is, if God was going to create human beings, Adam and Eve, did He create them as embryos? Well, they wouldn't last very long.
No.
He had to create them.
He would have to create them almost as adults.
Exactly.
Or someone fully functioning that can gather food and know how to eat and take care of themselves. Even a 12-year-old child, you toss a 12-year-old child out in the middle of the desert or the Garden of Eden, will probably die relatively soon.
Right. And can you put that man and woman on a planet that isn't developed? Right, yeah. That's still a primordial soup, or a hot ball of gases.
Were Adam and Eve married?
Well, they didn't have a preacher proclaim them married and take them through But yeah, they were married in a sense.
Well,
that's
God
a great
kind
question.
of like declared them.
Yeah, I mean, because marriage is
Yeah.
the staple of all relationships in the Bible between a man and a woman.
Well, in verse 17, it says, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife. So he's already recognizing her as his wife.
Okay.
So I'm sure there's a verse in there that's...
Because there are all kinds of different ways that you have to deal with your wife and not your wife. I mean, in God's word, premarital sex is a sin. Well, if they're not married... And that's certainly a temptation of all men, and men and women walking around, and how they're depicted is without clothes. And we know how we are when we see people without clothes. And is that just a cause of where our brains are through society now? Or have men always been that way, which I think men have probably always been that way. That's testosterone. It's always been around. That's what makes us think as brutes sometimes, as woman. Me get some, you know what that's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's evidence all the way through the Old Testament that was a problem.
Yes. Yeah. And so if they're not married and hanging out together, we all kind of know what happens when you hang out in the basement for too long with somebody of the opposite sex. Whether you don't intend nothing, stuff like that happens.
I don't think there was a marriage license, but there was definitely the Bible talks about marriage being a covenant. It's a relationship that is bound by a covenant, which is well, that's another whole episode.
I mean, because here we are, for marriage is a legal thing now. But I've been in my mind in a couple relationships in my life where I said, I'm not ever going anywhere. I'm married. Even though I don't need a piece of paper to say this is where I want to be for the rest of my life and who I want to be with. Mm-hmm. But yet our culture has turned it into a legal issue for tax reasons and this and that. And really it's only supposed to be about complementing each other and being the better half. What you're not good at, I'm good at. What I'm good at, you're not. And together we are way better than we were separate.
Yeah. I think that was a big problem for me in my divorce because I did look at it as a covenant, not just a piece of paper. But in order to get through my divorce, I did have to just realize, okay, I'm literally afraid of a piece of paper. Yeah. But at the same time, in my heart, I was like, I'd made a covenant. And even though at the time I was not very religious again, I still was always like, it felt weird. It's like I made this covenant.
Pact. Under God.
I did. And
Under God.
It even when I wasn't religious anymore, it still affected me. It's weird.
And that's, I think, the case for a lot of people, Milan, and myself included. I wasn't going to church. I wasn't practicing. I wasn't going every Sunday. I wasn't going to youth clubs and stuff on Wednesday and Bible study, any of that stuff. But yet, when I got married in a church and the church that I grew up in. Why? Why did it pull me back to the church I grew up in? Was it my mom? No, I was separated from my family. I mean, I didn't make any decisions based on what my parents wanted at that point. I was a grown man with a wife having a baby. Yeah, well, and so I got married. So with all that being said, how do marriages has turned into something these days, and we talked about this on one of the other podcasts a little bit, how I said the divorce rate is going up, and you said, no, the divorce rate's going down, and that's because people aren't getting married.
Yeah.
Why are we losing that that need to get married? And I can kind of answer a little bit. I say, especially the younger guys, when you see they work, get married, and then get divorced. And a lot of people and a lot of men certainly will have a lot of things taken from them at that point.
Yeah.
And decide that they don't want that to happen. Now, to me, that's very materialistic. Mm-hmm. Losing your children in a divorce or seeing them less or whatever, that's a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't really know where I was going with all that, but
I'm not sure either.
Yeah, but I just maybe jumped on my soapbox for a minute or whatever it was. But marriage is an institution that does not carry the same weight that it used to. I don't think.
Yeah. Well, the Bible is clear that marriage is a very specific relationship, and I think, again, going back to that whole our eyes have been opened, we know good from evil. What we've done is we've taken the responsibility and with that the opportunity to determine for ourselves what is good and evil. And so what we end up doing is we use God's word as more of a suggestion manual. And when it comes to everything, including marriage, we say, well, I think marriage is this and I think marriage is that. And hey, we're biased. We're going to make decisions based on what works best for us in the moment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, doesn't God consider marriage or divorce a sin?
Yes.
Okay. Now let me lead.
Go ahead.
That's just a leading question to this. Okay. Now, when it comes to divorce, only one party has to not want it.
Yeah.
So does that make the party that wanted it also a sinner, or that didn't want it a sinner, or because they didn't want the divorce? Is that not a sin that was taken? You see what I'm saying? And
I know what
that happened.
you're saying.
That's what happened to me. I did not want to get divorced. She wanted a divorce. She got the divorce whether I wanted it. I did not stand in her way, and we got it done in 6 months.
Yeah.
But at the same time, she wanted it. I didn't. Am I still a sinner because the divorce happened?
Well, and I'm in the same boat with you. I don't know if you know, but I had a marriage in my early 20s that ended with divorce, and that was completely instigated by my ex-wife. I didn't want the divorce. As a matter of fact, it was one of the most painful things that I ever experienced. And no, I think sometimes though we try to make sin a very specific thing when it really is a broader thing. So the divorce itself, what makes it sinful is that it's not God's will, right?
Yeah.
And so sin is not only the activity or the actions or the decisions of a sinful person, but sin can in some ways encompass just the flat out brokenness of things that don't go according to God's will. So sin, I consider the sin that happened there to contribute to my brokenness, but I don't think God was up there was there condemning me of sinning in that situation. So sometimes we think that sin is just simply bad behavior, and so if sin is assigned to something, then God is judging that as bad behavior on everybody's part. But sinfulness is broader than that. Does that make sense? Or is that confusing?
No, it kind of makes sense.
It makes sense, but is still confusing. I mean, if you can't go through the Bible and discuss sin and what this is and that is and not be confused, especially when you're first time through it, then he made this. Bible, I've said it before and I'll say it again, is not an easy read.
No, because there's lots of different interpretations you can take, but
words we don't use anymore.
Right, but I think it's like pure English language though, like from the beginning. But anyway,
people don't write like that anymore.
I was always raised that God, when you get your judgment, that He looks into your heart, and so I know that no matter what, I know I did everything I could have done to save my marriage or any of that. I don't feel if there is judgment towards the end that I don't want to say I'm going to be blameless. But I do believe that I'm not going to be judged as a sinner for my marriage failing when same situation, I didn't want it. And not that I was fighting to keep it after he filed paperwork and stuff, but it did take a long time. But I didn't want it. And I really feel in my heart that it's not something that God will hold over my head. I feel I did what I could. And it's something that happened. It happened in my life. I feel I'm stronger because of it. Not to say that I wouldn't be as strong now if the divorce didn't happen, but I kind of look at it as, I don't want to say it was all preordained, like this was God's plan for me altogether, that I'm sitting in this seat right now today with all my life circumstances.
Neither one of us would be if we didn't have those divorces.
It's true. But I kind of feel like maybe
or you, Milan,
these plans,
same deal.
Maybe these plans didn't work out and there's always a fork in the road. And I just, I took the other path. He took that path. And this path is bringing me where I need to be. And he's the one that didn't choose to join.
Yeah. Well,
if that makes sense.
Well, that's good because I don't want him on the radio show.
It's pretty funny though.
This is where the concept of grace is so important. Is that God's grace covers a lot of stuff, right?
Right.
A lot of the mess of the world. Doesn't fix it all. Doesn't make it all better, but it does. I when I went through that whole thing, Rob, I felt guilty. I felt ashamed. I felt. It's bad in so many different ways.
Right. You feel unlovable, unwanted, unworthy.
What did I do wrong?
Yeah, I did everything.
So,
all of it.
So in a lot of ways, I had to enter back into that childlike faith and simply say, God, I can't make sense of all of this, but I know that you love me and I need your healing in my life and I need forgiveness and I need, again, and even forgiveness, not because I did something specifically wrong. I didn't have an affair or anything like that, but I need to know that God's grace is there to bring wholeness to Back to that whole thing we talked about the last time in creation, God brought order to the chaos. God's grace brings order to the chaos that sin creates.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, maybe it's the grace I have for my ex-husband. I don't think that he will be judged either. I think that there will, in my head, judgment. It'd be more of like a conversation. Hey, you made these choices and these were your rewards for it. These could have been your rewards if you had stayed the course or tried to save your marriage or whatever the situation is. It doesn't have to be your marriage, but choices and opportunities that you're presented in life. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm just healed or healing still, but I just don't feel like there's even going to be that judgment like that for him, even though he's the one that wanted it. Because I don't know, everything for me has been pretty good.
Could divorce actually be part of God's plan? Because it's a very, very huge learning experience for a lot of people. And one of the most traumatic things that you can go through. So when you go through it, does it not make you stronger and more resilient after? Some people probably not. But I think most people probably. So I don't know. I've always divorced as a sin, but there's so much of it and so much positive that does come out of it eventually. Maybe you don't see it right away, not seeing the kids every day. That was the worst thing for me. It wasn't getting divorced from my wife. It was not seeing my children every day, coming home to them every day, letting them be able to jump on me as soon as I got home. I wasn't a guy I played softball in the summer. I played a lot of games. It was like one during the week and I would play like every other weekend. But other than that, if I wasn't at work, I was at home.
Yeah.
Maybe at home too much, and that was the problem. But I was home, and I wasn't doing all those bad things. I wanted to be there with my kids, and that was the worst part of divorce, was not getting to see them every day and knowing that I had my influence on them every day. And then when there's another man, when she's remarried, has influence, and this guy doesn't really talk to them. I was never that way. I've had girlfriends with kids, and I like being around their kids. I like talking to them. And I don't know how you could be a step parent and ignore the kids. I get it. Okay, whole different story. Didn't really want to talk about my marriage back in, but I was divorced in 2007. So
it's been a minute.
2008, I think it was done. Yeah. So it's been a while.
Let me just real quick go back to the main question that you kind of started that whole deal with. Is divorce ever God's plan? And I would say absolutely not. Just a clear, absolutely not, full stop. But what I would say is that God's grace is so amazing that God can use some of the most broken things. And you spoke a little bit to the absolute brokenness of the whole result of divorce, breaking the relationship between father and children and all of that stuff. I do believe that when surrendered to God, he can take even the most terrible things, sinful things, and turn them around and bring good out of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Deep. That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
It really is. All right. Well, not that I'm saying this is the end of this podcast, but I'm thinking that we probably should. Is there anything else that we want to discuss about Genesis 3 and probably wrap this one up? I
had a little thing. In verse 13, when God is saying to Eve, "What hast thou done?" Mm-hmm. It kind of goes back to that judgment. And she was like, "The serpent beguiled me." And I don't know, just from this conversation, I just kept thinking, it's like, what would I say as my excuse, like for my divorce or for anything bad in life? And I don't know. Then I started thinking too. Well, here's the one thing I will have to say. I want you to continue, but I think part of God's grace is you have to own it. Right. Sure. You have to own it. It's not someone else's fault. Oh, the devil made me do it. The snake made me do it. I was deceived. No, I knew better and did it anyways. And that is almost always the case. But did she really know before she had the fruit from the knowledge from the tree? Well, her eyes were opened. Her eyes were open when she had the fruit. Yeah. And so it's kind of like a child when they do something bad and they have to go to their mom, or before they go to tell their parents find out and they come to them and say, "Hey, what did you do?" And they're immediately, "She made me do it."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just kind of showing,
it's
like,
not my fault.
Going back from, I kind of related it too, because from church, going from living in the church and then being one with the world and then coming back to the church. And my eyes have been so open and I understand I understand so much more now.
Yeah.
Like the sheep that was
more.
lost, and he went and he still found that lost sheep, and like the prodigal son and all those stories. And it makes sense to me now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we didn't really dive much into the nature of sin, and how that, even the fact that, and then Adam blames Eve and the serpent, and it speaks to the way that we respond to sin. Our eyes are open, and so maybe in the next episode we could dig a little bit more into that.
That's what I was about to say. Is the nature of sin was another episode. I know you and I had talked about maybe this being like transitioning to the 7 deadly sins. Does that work the same way with the nature of sin, or are those two different subjects?
Definitely well connected. Yeah. We've got to. It's important for us to understand the nature of sin in a world that has widely dismissed the idea that sin even exists.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're setting ourselves up for a pretty consistent smack in the head.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think this brings us to a pretty logical conclusion of this podcast. I certainly want to tell you out there, go back to tabootalkback.com and you can check out our last episodes. Maybe get acquainted with them before you move on to the next one, because we're going to be talking about sin and the 7 deadly sins, which are part of it. And it's one of those things where you hear those words. Well, you hear some words used these days as, and I'll just throw it now, when you would probably talk about one of the big ones in there is pride. They talk about as being one of the 7 deadly sins, yet we have things that are pride this, pride that, pride all the time. Even with, schools, school spirit, school pride. We talk about that. Is that one of those deadly sins? We're going to talk about that on the next podcast of all the things that they don't want you to talk about right here. I wanted to say on Rob Byrd's Moondog Show, but we're not. I'll also make sure that you check out anywhere. If you just do a Google search for Halftime with Milan Bittenbender, you can find his podcast also, which he does a lot of things that are different than what we're doing here, but I'm sure it probably all kind of wraps together.
Oh, yeah.
All right. We'll see you next time on All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About. You have a great evening, day, or night. All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast is part of the Rob Byrd Moondog Podcast Network. Go to tabootalkback.com for more information. Copyright 2024.